Hello all, and welcome. Although my good friend Shivers is currently taking a break from narrating, I thought we could celebrate many of our previous collaborations in this new compilation video. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control.
So this happened to me about 15 years ago when I was 12. My family and I are super into dance and doing all kinds of competitions, state championships, nationals, etc. Many times our competitions would require us to travel to different states. This time we went to Vegas. Mind you, even though I was only 12 years old, I always looked and acted a lot older and could easily be mistaken for closer to 16, but still. This experience had always stayed in my mind as one of the most what the hell moments. I also watched a lot of Unsolved Mysteries and Lifetime as a kid, and thank God I did, because I'm pretty sure they saved my life. Anyway, we were in Vegas for a dance competition, and one of our non-competition days, we decided to go exploring. It was me, my mother, my auntie, and my 3 younger sisters. There was this cool place right along the strip, called the Lua or something with a Hawaiian theme, that was kind of like a little square, with different random vendors, an animal and magic show, and different food operations. At one point the rest of my family was watching some para act, and my younger sister and I, who was maybe around 10, were walking around the different vendors looking at jewellery and such. That was when an older man, maybe in his early 30s from my memory, who had heavy mid-eastern accent, approached the stand we were at. He came and sat right next to me and said hello. I responded with a smile and said hi back. I've always been polite and talkative and assumed he was one of the vendors. He asked me what we were doing, how I liked Vegas, and various harmless seeming questions. It was harmless until my sister walked back to our mother to watch the show. That is when it got super creepy, and he started telling me how pretty I was and asked if my sister was my daughter, which I laughed and told him I was only 12. At one point he asked me if I liked the jewellery, and I told him that I thought it was very pretty but I didn't have any money on me and was just looking. His response was, "I own a shop around the corner, and a pretty woman like you deserves pretty things. If you come with me, I'll let you pick out anything you want for free." At this point, my Lifetime movie experiences are kicking in. As a panic, all things kind of flash through my head about what will happen if I leave with him. I politely decline, but he keeps insisting, and at this point he has taken hold of my arm to steer me in the direction of an alley of where his shop is. In my dumb panic, I kind of freeze and say, "Yeah, I'll come right back. I have to check my mum or she'll freak." He smiles and says okay and lets go of my arm and says, "Come this way when you're ready, gorgeous," pointing again in the direction of the alley. I booked it back to my family and didn't say anything and just sat silently, panicking about the whole experience. When we got up to leave, we had to walk past the alley, where he kept gesturing for me to follow him, and when I ignored him, the smile he had kept on his face the whole time turned into a glare, and I noped out of there as fast as possible without freaking out my mum. It's so clear that this man had sinister motives behind his facade. A little background information before I get started. This happened to me in my junior year of high school. I lived about a 5-minute walking distance from my school, and my dad left for work every day around 5, so I didn't have a car, and I walked to and from school every day. Most of my neighbours were fairly nice, and if they were outside whilst I was walking around, they would usually say hi or something to that nature. I had lived in this neighbourhood for years, so I knew almost everyone. Every day on my way from school, I would pass this really good-looking guy outside his house, usually smoking a cigarette. He would say hi and finish smoking, and I walked towards my house. Nothing unusual. After a while, he built up the nerve to talk to me. He was really cute, and for me being an awkward teen girl, I was thrilled by this attention. He would make small talk with me, nothing weird at first, and it went on for about a week. After a while I noticed that he would be outside his house every day in the morning and after school, like clockwork. This made me feel uneasy. He would start talking to me every day after school, asking if I was single, if I wanted to get coffee, if he could have my phone number. I came up with excuses every time. Then he started asking me to come inside. This was a red flag. He was clearly older than me, maybe 23. And I started to notice that he shook, like a lot, and that his hair was starting to fall out. This made me feel even more uncomfortable. Somehow he got my phone number, and he would text me, excessively, always asking me to date him and come to his house. He actually came to my house one day and asked my dad if he could date me. My neighbourhood knew my dad very well. They knew not to mess with him or me, so my dad told him to stay away from me. That worked for a while, until one day my dad went to his house to help his mother with something, and he told my dad how much he enjoyed watching porn and thinking of me, and how he wished he could date me. My dad pretty much told him to never come near my house again or he would regret it. Well, about a month later during the summer, I was hanging out with a group of friends when we went outside to see cop cars outside of Creeper's house. Cop cars in our neighbourhood weren't too unusual, so we shrugged it off and continued to hang out. After about an hour, we got back inside to see more cop cars and a helicopter circling. By this time we were more than curious, and so we stuck outside to see what was going on. After a few minutes, a K9 unit showed up, followed by a SWAT vehicle. They surrounded the house, and after a good hour, they pulled him out and into a cop car. We found out that he locked his mother out of the house, barricaded all the entrances, and when the cops tried to get him out, he told them that he had guns. Lots of them. I found out later that he was a drug addict and a schizophrenic. So creepy cute neighbour, let's not meet again.
Oh boy, do I have a story to tell. I was a daily driver at this pizza place I was working at. On my usual grind, I hit the second house of my double and knock on the door. Oh, and I forgot to add, this was an online order. Anyway, so I get to this door of this really shitty house in a surprisingly nice neighborhood, but they had some really nice cars. So I knock and wait about a minute. This guy comes up and just starts yelling, "Who the fuck ordered pizza?" So I get a little nervous and think I went to the wrong house. But I hear in the background, I did, in a real subtle voice. So this guy says to come in, which I don't want to do, seeing that I had about $1,000 in cash on me. This dude is fucking persistent though. So I walk in and he leads me to the kitchen. As I turn into the living room / kitchen area, I see a girl who looked about 21, but had been hit by a truck. She was on the couch with a needle in her arm. Instantly, I just wanted to run. I'd never seen someone do heroin before, and I really didn't want to stay to see what happens. This guy tells me to put the pizzas on the counter, and starts yelling, "Bitch, how the fuck are we gonna pay for these?" Me, basically shitting my pants, almost said that they were free. So she says to use the wad in the drawer. This guy pulls out a drawer with probably $1 billion and 3 pistols. I'm profusely sweating now. He pulls all the guns out and leaves them on the counter, and gives me $50 on a $19 order, and says, "Keep the change." As I turn to run the fuck out, his buddies come in the back door saying they got the hookup on some crack deal, and just started smoking it right then and there. Me, being an innocent 18-year-old from the nicest place in Texas, was so scared that they were gonna shoot me. So I get back into my car and go about 100 back to the store, and block them from ever ordering from us again.
I used to live in Albin, Wyoming, which is next to the capital of the state. And if you've never been to Wyoming, then it's basically like any other generic rocky state, known for its many lakes and things like that. We tend to get a lot of tourists that come down to spend their holidays here, since inward living is so expensive. I'm in the United States Air Force, and have been stationed at Warren Air Force Base as a vehicle operator. So, anyway, I decided I wanted to try living off base after cross training, and figured I should try renting a home close to my base. I was still really young, only just turned 22, and when I discovered a simple one-bedroom home in the rural town of Albin, I was ecstatic. Being from Oklahoma and growing up in a rural district myself, I was a big fan of it. This town, however, was really small. You can walk a couple of blocks and you'd be at the end of the town in a matter of minutes. So I would actually jog round the town every morning when I first moved in. It was 2014 and I had just moved off base and into the house after getting clearance. It was a steal at only $250 a month, and with all the extra money I had, I decided to put a down payment on a new vehicle and thought, what the hell, I might as well get my own internet service provider and a gaming computer, since I just love to game out and unwind from it. Plus, the internet service in Wyoming is pretty shit, and getting your own provider is a must. So it's September now, and the first 2 weeks were really great. I was getting all kinds of sleep in my home, having friends over for Friday night football, occasionally going out to parties, and trying my luck at the women since I was still single then. It was the beginning of October when this happened. The early night after getting off work, all I wanted to do was go to sleep, so I lazily brushed my teeth and within a few minutes I was already in bed. I laid there for a solid 3 minutes at least before dozing off. During that time, I had probably the worst dream I would ever experience in my life. I only remember some parts vividly, but it was something hovering over my bed, and this something was giving me the most disgusted look. I couldn't tell what it was, and I couldn't even sketch it. All that I can say is that it was horrifying through those few minutes, since all it did was hover over me and give out a very faint whisper, which I didn't really understand what it was saying. I woke up in a very heated sweat and was extremely exhausted from that point. I looked around the room and it was pitch black, figuring it must have been a nightmare. I checked the clock to see it was reading 3:50 in the morning, too early, and figured that since I couldn't get back to sleep, I may as well walk around the town. I got up and put my clothes on, and with it being chilly outside, I took my time walking around town. Now I'm a paranoid guy, and I always have been, so of course I carried my handgun when I'm out. It's an M11 Sig Sauer for all you guys wanting specific details. I went for my walk, and after a few hours of clearing my head, I felt fine and started making my trail back home, with it being sunrise soon. When I got back to my house, I found the front door wide open. Now I know I locked my door when I left, and I came back to find it wide open. I was shit scared. I felt my heart drop into my stomach, and I knew I was pale. I checked the side of the house to see if any of the back gates were disturbed, but to no avail. I then returned my attention back to the front of my home, where I then unholstered my handgun and began moving forward. I entered the home with the gun at the ready, not shutting the door, because I feared that the intruder might hear me before I find him. As carefully and as slowly as I could, I searched every inch of every room from top to bottom to find the whole home completely empty and everything undisturbed. I kept repeating the chain of events when I left the house, trying to find some excuse or way to think that I may have left the door unlocked, or even open. but I specifically remember putting my key in the bolt lock and twisting it. I knew this because I even kept the key on my person, knowing that I would use it to unlock the door. I didn't know what to make of it, and I decided that I would change the locks of the front door by the end of the week. A couple of days later, it was around late as always, but since I didn't have to show up at my early hours and got much sleep before arriving, I felt real well and thought about playing some Red Orchestra too, like the nerd I am. When I got home, the one thing that stood out immediately as I walked back inside was how hot it was. It was a chilly 38 degrees outside, and my entire house felt like it was in the 80s. I couldn't believe how hot it was, and I thought I may have left the heater on. So I went to check it, and I found that it was reading 83 degrees Fahrenheit. I figured I would leave my home tolerable with it being cold, but the heater wasn't the best, and the max it would go is only 75 on a really good day. The fireplace inside is what I usually use to keep myself warm. I still couldn't believe it, which was almost like a shock factor, so I figured maybe the heater had a good boost and finally started to work. And it was just in time too, since a snowstorm was preparing to hit eventually. I turned the temperature down and made my way to my bedroom. All was well in those couple of hours, only when the sudden loud bang of something hitting against my wall on the other side of the room caused me to jump and focus all of my attention on it. I hesitated and just sat there for around 2 minutes, my breath very heavy as I started to feel myself going pale once more. I didn't know how to react, and once again I thought it was an intruder. I reached for my pistol, which I always kept at close proximity, and slowly angled it against the door. At that moment, I wished real hard that it was an intruder, because instead, it was nothing. But what I found was a large hole against my wall, and my snow globe on the floor, cracked at the bottom. I quickly searched the rest of the home to find it empty as well, and I started contemplating what it could have been. Looking around and continuing to think, I then started to get really nervous when I thought of the dream from before. I thought of it a couple of times previously, but at that time when it came into my mind, it made me grow very uneasy. I walked back to my room to find my computer monitor turned off. I thought that it was possibly the computer going to sleep mode, but that faded when I found the back of the VGA cord unplugged and lying on the floor. I plugged it back in and settled onto my computer chair, gun at the ready on my desk, whilst I started to look off ahead outside my doorway into the living room. I got the feeling someone was looking back at me, and it was definitely not a good feeling at all. I had the feeling of someone looking at me with very malicious intent, an extreme notion of harm, but I didn't know what. I had no idea what occurred to me at the time, but for some reason I told myself to lift up my phone and to take a picture of outside my bedroom door. I then turned my computer monitor back on and just tuned myself out of whatever was happening. About an hour later, with the real deep feeling no longer there, I pulled my phone out and checked on the photo that I'd taken. And every time I look at the photo, it freaks me out to this day. I still can't look at it, thinking how bad whatever it was looks like. I don't know how this photo did not get lost over the years, but what it is none other than a pair of red glowing eyes staring straight back at me from the outside. I couldn't believe it at first, and I actually began hyperventilating at the time. I was shit scared of what it actually was. When I saw this photo, I thought I was going to just run out the door right there and then. This is the most bizarre thing I've ever seen, and I kept looking at it to see if it was real, and after a few minutes of finally deciding, okay, I just went ahead and shut my door, locked it from my side and slept with the television and lights on. The next day, I got up and went to work as normal, Nothing happened in the weeks that followed until December 4th. During that time, I was actually already planning on moving back to the base, after a few more incidents had occurred, mainly seeing things out of the corner of my eye, hearing knocking, sounding of footsteps, and all sorts of other things. I asked the property manager if he knew anything about this, and he went on to say that he had no idea. That night in December would be my last one staying at that house. It went on as normal when I heard a noise. At first I just shrugged it off. I was simply too used to it by that point to care. At first a few light taps were occurring and it didn't bother me. Only when the light taps turned into a loud slam, when it finally caused me to jump and just stare outside my door. I was hesitant to get up, listening to the silence, when I finally started to slowly stand to my feet and grab my handgun as always. I walked around the room, looking off to find my kitchen empty and with nothing around it. But my light to my bathroom, that I always leave on, was off. So I figured the bulb may have finally burnt out. So I started approaching towards it before what I felt like was an extreme burning sensation started appearing at the top of my right hand where I had my gun. I stopped and looked over, and what I saw still gives me goosebumps. It was a scratch mark. 3 claw marks at the top of my hand. I started to slowly step back, and then I turned around and made my way around the small bar table I had in the front of the kitchen, taking another glance up at the bathroom door when I saw what looked like something so tall. Its head touched the ceiling. It was all black, but with distinct features of a huge figure, and what looked like also horns at the top of its head. I don't want to exaggerate too much if they were horns, but it is what made my heart drop when it was the very same red eye staring back right at me. I actually rushed back to my bedroom and started breathing deeply, completely afraid of what it was. It is a really scary feeling when it is something you cannot fight, something that is completely invulnerable to you, and realizing that I was at the mercy of whatever it was. I made like a pussy and ran damn straight out of there. I had had enough at this point. I was done. I grabbed my phone, wallet, whatever I would need for work tomorrow, and I was out that door and in my car on the road in the next 5 minutes. I drove all the way to Cheyenne and got a hotel room, spending the night there and going to work the next day. By this point I was fully done with that house, and I outright refused to even set foot inside there. I stayed with a friend until my contract cleared though, and my service got me back in the barracks. I didn't go back to that house for a couple of days after that, finally getting the confidence with a friend, saying that he would come along with me to collect my things. I told him I was moving out of the house since it was breaking down, so not to scare him. I collected all my things in the daytime, and was all wrapped up and finished in about an hour and a half with nothing happening. Only after we were on the road heading back to base that I told him everything, and I felt bad for making him go inside, since he started freaking out with him being scared of ghosts more than I am. Today, I'm stationed in Germany, and about to go on to school for Tactical Air Control Party while serving as a telecommunications operator, successfully cross-trained. I have a girlfriend, and I'm living in a decent-sized flat that thankfully is not haunted. I'm doing really well for myself now at the age of 24, and preparing to re-enlist soon. I want this to be documented whilst it's still fresh in my mind, and I still talk about it from time to time, although after all that's happened, I can safely say that the house in Albin was one of the most scariest incidences that has happened to me to date. My friend told me that the owner of the house recently passed away, and the house caught fire and burnt to the ground, so it's no longer there. I don't know how or why. I'm just glad I don't ever have to live with it still up, and think that the fact that no one has to go through what I did. I just want to focus on my own thing right now, and let that drift away into the past.
I was the caretaker at a ranch just outside of Yellowstone National Park. It was winter, and my dog and I were the only two on the property. Overnight, there was a large snowstorm. I woke up at 5 a.m. to my dog barking and a knock on the front door. I woke startled and waited for another knock before I got out of bed. My dog was now pacing and moaning, so I stumbled to the front door and opened it up. There was no one there. Not a single track in the snow leading to the house in the fresh 15 inches of powder. And my nearest neighbor was 2 miles away. I went back to bed and didn't think too much about it. Later that morning I woke and my dog and I went to town to work my other job as a ski technician. When I returned home later that night, my back door was wide open. Still, the only tracks to or from the house were mine and my pup's. I searched the entire property, and still no new tracks. Searching the house, I found that the bed had been slept on in the guest bedroom. That bed had been made and neat for weeks. There was still an indentation of someone's head on the pillow. This was an old ranch, and I've heard rumors that a few people had died in this cabin.
So, when I was 14, my parents transferred me to a private Catholic prep school. I was not happy about changing districts and had a really hard time making friends as a young teen. A few weeks into the semester, I was invited to a sleepover with 3 girls that I knew from English class. I really didn't know these girls very well, but my mum made me go anyway, in an effort to help me adjust. One of these girls, Kathy, brought tarot cards and a Ouija board to the party. I had never played with a Ouija board before, and didn't consider myself a believer in anything outside the realm of science and logic. I was assured it was nothing more than a board game based on a legend, and because I was a goth, I would enjoy the experience. The 4 of us, Zoe, Kathy, Jess and myself, set up the board in the late afternoon in the middle of Jess's bedroom. Right from the start, the board was crazy active. I was heavily skeptical, and didn't want to play if the other girls were not going to take it seriously. They swore that they were not messing around, and strangely, the board continued to spell out things like hello and play, over and over, before we could ask it any direct questions. We finally asked if there was a spirit with us, and if it had a name, to which it responded, Hector. This was when Jess began getting anxious. She told us that when she was about 5, she had a childhood imaginary friend named Hector. Still skeptical, but officially creeped out, we asked Hector if he had any other spirits with him. He said yes. We asked if he knew their names, and with no hesitation, the board spelled out the name Marie. Now this time, Zoe broke down crying and did not want to play anymore. We stopped playing to console her, but she was very worked up. Apparently, just 3 months earlier, her grandmother Marie had passed away from cancer. Since we were only classmates, there was no way that any of us could have known that information. Zoe refused to play after that, despite our attempts to get her to say goodbye. Kathy, Jess and I continued to play without Zoe, which proved also to be a mistake. The place where Zoe was sitting felt ice cold compared to the rest of the room, and the planchette kept moving, changing places on the board without us touching it. We closed up the board and put it and tried to move on from that experience. Later that evening, whilst we were eating dinner, Jess's 5-year-old brother began telling us about his imaginary friend, Hector, which conveniently had the same description and backstory to his older sister's childhood imagination. We asked if he knew anything about his sister's imaginary friend, and he said no. All of the paranormal talk reached Jess's mother, who quickly sent us home, and we were never invited back again.
This happened 4 months after the birth of our beautiful baby girl. Our little girl was the sweetest, most gentle little newborn any new parent could have asked for. We named our little one after the month she was born in, May. May was born on a rainy night. I was the only one in labor on the entire floor that night. Like any new mother, I was exhausted after hours of labor. All I wanted to do was rest. My husband Matt looked after our little one while I rested a bit, but he eventually fell asleep too. I was laying in my bed watching my new family sleep peacefully, when I felt a sudden urge to use the restroom. I called for my nurse, asking her to help me get up and walk over to the bathroom. After a few minutes, the nurse came in. I hushed her as she began speaking. I pointed to Matt, who was passed out on the sofa. The nurse and I quietly exited and began walking to the bathroom. As we were making our way back to my bed, another nurse came in carrying a small blanket. She walked in and began looking around. When my nurse asked her who she was looking for, her coworker looked confused. She began explaining to us as she was passing over to the nurse station. She walked past her room and saw a little girl with long black hair standing on her tiptoes, looking at her newborn baby girl. The nurse mentioned that the little girl was wearing a dress and assumed she might need a blanket since the room was chilly. I looked at my nurse confused and a little worried that someone else's kid could just walk into my room and look at my newborn without anybody but the nurse noticing. I quickly told her that May was my firstborn and that we weren't expecting any visitors. I asked if perhaps the little girl had gotten separated from her parents' room. However, my nurse was quick to mention that there were no other families at the moment with children on the floor. A few months after that, Matt and I moved into our new home. We were immediately welcomed by everyone, and we liked our new neighborhood. As we were unpacking and setting up May's room, I pulled out some baby monitors that we were planning on using now that May would be sleeping on her own. Matt and I were testing the baby monitors for a while. He was upstairs in May's room, and I was downstairs in the kitchen. After a few successful tries, I began making dinner, leaving my baby monitor on the counter. I was cutting vegetables when I began to hear static on the monitor. Thinking it was Matt probably messing with it upstairs, I ignored it and turned it off. I walked over to the fridge when I heard a very faint voice. I walked over to the counter and picked up the monitor, pressing firmly against my ear. A very faint but identifiable noise was coming from the static. I realized right away it sounded like a young child's laughing. I turned around looking at May. She lay quietly on her swing, sleeping soundly. I turned back to the monitor, trying to make out the noise again, when suddenly it stopped. The lights on the monitor went down and stayed off. Matt came in the moment through the back door, carrying some tools from the shed. I asked him if he had taken the baby monitor with him outside. He looked at me and laughed at my strange question. He replied back saying that he had left the baby monitor upstairs a while ago. I began telling him what I had just heard. He shrugged it off and explained that it was most likely interference from another family's monitor. A few days after that, I decided to take May to the park. We left home and began making our way down the street when my next door neighbor stopped us. My next door neighbor was a sweet old lady. She began talking to May and asked me how everything was going. She was very good around May, and she held her excitedly and began telling me how nice it was to have a baby in the neighborhood. I asked her if there were any other children in the neighborhood, to which she quickly replied, no. Oh, sweetheart, there haven't been any children here in a long time, but it's sure nice to finally have one around. She continued playing with May. As I began remembering the baby monitor static, I assumed that the monitor probably didn't work anymore, and told myself to remember later to tell Matt that we needed a new one, when she began talking again. She mentioned that she was always willing to babysit, in case Matt and I ever needed it. I thanked her for her offer and began pushing May's stroller when she suddenly turned towards me and replied, Of course, dear. I can understand if you need a break. This little one has a mouth, doesn't she? I heard her cries all last night. I couldn't help but to think, what strong lungs she has. I looked at her confused, and began explaining that May always slept through the night, and cried very little. May certainly didn't cry loud or long enough for someone next door to hear. She nodded, then winked at me. She most likely thought that I was attempting to hide my embarrassment at being unable to control my crying baby, when she turned around and walked back to her house. That night, I told Matt what our neighbor had said. He laughed, saying exactly what I had earlier. May sleeps through the night, and hardly ever cries. That old lady is crazy, or probably missing her meds. I agreed, and asked him to replace the baby monitors before changing the conversation. The next day, Matt installed the new baby monitors before he left to work. May and I stayed home for the rest of the day. We left one baby monitor in May's room, another one in the bedroom, and another one in the kitchen. I was upstairs cleaning our room, which was directly across the hall and 2 doors away from May's, when I began hearing the static again. I walked over to my nightstand and sat in my bed, attempting to make out the sound from the baby monitor. I didn't hear May crying, but instead I heard the same laughter I heard with the previous monitor. I walked over to May's room carrying the monitor. Once again, she was sound asleep. May's monitor wasn't even playing anything. It stood on the dresser, silent. The lights didn't even turn on as I heard the laughter through the monitor I was carrying. Thinking it was strange, but not yet giving it to any paranormal explanation, I began walking downstairs to the kitchen when the sound suddenly stopped. I tried to shrug it off and continued cleaning, figuring that perhaps the area we live in made it easier to pick up sounds at a further distance. That night for dinner, I didn't tell Matt about the noise incident earlier that day. Matt seemed tired from work, and I didn't want to worry him with something that seemed like nonsense. A few nights after that, Matt and I were sleeping when I suddenly awoke. I was drenched in sweat and couldn't fall back to sleep. I decided to get up and go check on May. As I walked across the hall towards her room, I heard the static noise coming from downstairs. I stopped and pushed May's door open to make sure she wasn't awake. But sure enough, she was asleep, as always. The static was coming from the kitchen. I knew it was coming from the monitor. Being sleepy and tired, I became annoyed and decided to go downstairs and shut it off. I entered the kitchen and turned the lights on, reaching for the monitor on the counter. I turned the monitor around, looking for a button to shut it off, when I realized it was already off. I stood there dumbfounded and placed it back on the counter, walking away thinking that perhaps I had imagined it when I heard the static again. I turned around immediately. The lights on the monitor were on. I walked over, getting ready to throw the monitor across the room, when the sound stopped again. There's a large trash bin next to the counter. It was one of those ones you would step on in order to flip up the lid. As I stood there, staring down at the monitor, I caught a glimpse of a reflection on the trash bin. For a few seconds I saw what looked like a small child. A little girl reflected on the trash bin and directly behind me. I turned around terrified, expecting to see her. However, no one stood behind me. I looked around desperately, trying to find what had made the reflection, when the baby monitor in my hand had turned on again. The laughter was more clear. It was a child laughing and giggling. I dropped the monitor on the floor and darted upstairs towards May's room. More frightened than I had ever been in my entire life, I picked up May and took her to our bedroom. I woke up Matt, attempting to explain what I just heard. He woke up half asleep and went downstairs to check up on it. He came back upstairs a few minutes later, looking at me like I was crazy. He went back to bed and fell asleep immediately after. The next morning, May and I were out front on the porch, enjoying a beautiful day, when our neighbor came over. She looked worn out, nervous, and had black bags under her eyes. She wore pajamas, which were noticeably dirty. I greeted her, asking if she wanted any lemonade, before she interrupted me. She began saying how she hadn't been able to sleep well these past few days because of May's cries at night. I looked at her confused once again, and explained to her that May hadn't been crying at night. She started playing with her hands nervously and began saying that she could hear May screaming and crying every night. When she noticed I wasn't believing what she was telling me, her entire personality changed in an instant. She started yelling out profanity and telling me to, and I quote, "Take your little shit away from here and shut it the fuck up." Feeling threatened, I stood up and went over to May. While picking her up, I told the woman to leave. She stood there looking at May, angry and resentful. She kept yelling at us, startling May as she began to cry. I threatened her with calling the cops and kept telling her to leave before she finally decided to walk off. I went inside the house shaken up, and I felt upset that my neighbor would act in such a way where I felt threatened. I called Matt, asking him to leave work early, explaining what just happened. He immediately left the office and started heading home. As soon as he arrived home, I explained further what our neighbor had said. He became extremely upset. As he held May, we talked about what our neighbor had said regarding May's crying at night. He also didn't understand what our neighbor was talking about. May was a good baby. She hardly gave us any grief. As we were talking, we heard a knock on the door. Thinking that it was our next door neighbor again, Matt gave me May as he went to go see who was knocking. I let out a sigh of relief when our neighbor from across the street came in. Mr. Moss was one of the first friends we made when we moved here. Matt invited him to sit down and offered him something to drink. Mr. Moss politely declined, saying that he came over to talk to us about something very important. Matt and I sat down. I laid May on her swing, giving Mr. Moss my complete attention. He began explaining that earlier that morning, he had seen our next-door neighbor come over and start screaming at me. He explained that for a few days now, our neighbor had been acting kinda strange, and he had noticed it when coming home from work. He mentioned that on one particular night, he pulled up to his house after working late and he noticed her outside. She was standing outside in her pajamas on the side of the house while looking up at the window above her. When I asked him for details on the window she was looking up at, he explained that it was the one on the second floor in the right corner of the house. I looked at Matt nervously. As Mr. Moss described May's window, Matt held my hands tightly. Mr. Moss went on to explain that after he pulled up to the driveway, he noticed that she wasn't moving. He found it curious that she didn't even look to see what car it was. Not wanting to spook her, in case she hadn't noticed him, he went inside his house to continue some work he still had left. He said that he was working on his laptop for a couple hours before deciding to go to sleep. As he was turning off the lights, he looked out the window, noticing that my neighbor was still standing there staring up. He started fidgeting on the sofa while he spoke to us, as if what he was saying scared him. What he said next frightened me to the point of tears. This time she wasn't standing alone, he said. He saw what seemed to be a little girl standing behind her, looking at her. He estimated the little girl was probably no more than 5 years old. She was wearing a dress and had long black hair. He mentioned that while looking outside his window, he gasped a little. And at that exact moment, the girl slowly turned away from my neighbor and turned her head towards him. He said at that moment he was scared and immediately closed his blinds and laid in bed too frightened to go to sleep. I asked him if he went up to go look again, to which he replied no. Matt and I thanked him as he left the house. We looked at each other deeply concerned about what he just shared. After a few hours of discussion about potentially getting the police involved, Matt got up to use the bathroom. I sat there completely lost in thought when I began hearing the baby monitor from the kitchen again. I stood up and ran to the kitchen. I stared at it while the familiar static slowly cleared to laughter. I picked up the monitor and ran towards the bathroom, pressing it firmly against the door, yelling at Matt to come out. He opened the door, asking what was wrong, when he stopped to hear the laughter playing on the monitor. I gave the baby monitor to him as we ran upstairs to May's room. We had put her to sleep upstairs after she passed out on her swing. We ran inside her room, nervous and scared, when we saw that she still lay there, sleeping in her crib. We looked at each other confused. The monitor he was holding suddenly went silent from the static. I stared at it before turning it around and shutting it off. We stood there in silence, attempting to rationalize what just happened, when the monitor in our bedroom turned on and began letting out that same laughter we just heard. The door was open and the baby monitor stood on my nightstand. Matt and I could see it clearly from May's room. The laughter got louder and louder as it suddenly started playing on all 3 monitors. I picked up May, scared and crying at the same time. Matt held me as he dropped the monitor he was holding. The laughter went from child's laughter to something that sounded completely demonic. Right as we began running out of the room, the voice let out one last piercing scream. It screamed cry. As soon as it said that, we heard a gunshot that sounded like it came from next door. May woke up and began crying at the chaos in her room. Matt and I were getting ready to make a run for it when the laughter suddenly stopped. We ran out as fast as we could. Other neighbors started coming out of their homes, getting ready to investigate the gunshot. We bumped into Mr. Moss, waiting for the police to arrive, when two men decided to go inside our next-door neighbor's house to investigate. After a few minutes, one immediately came running out yelling, "We need an ambulance!" After about an hour of standing outside, Matt and I were still too afraid to go back inside for our car keys. We waited outside among all the police officers and Mr. Moss, hoping to overhear what had happened. A short, stubby lady that lived a few houses down came up to us explaining that she just overheard one of the men who had gone in to investigate. She said that the men found our next-door neighbor's body sitting in a chair, looking directly out the window with a gunshot wound in her head. I stood there stunned to hear that she decided to take her own life. When the lady continued speaking, she said that the gun was on the second floor and that she had cuts all over her arms, which seemed to be self-inflicted. She went on to explain, directly behind her on the wall, she had spelt out, "She won't stop crying," in her own blood. Matt and I left the majority of things at that house. We moved across the country and kept in contact with only Mr. Moss over the years. We wanted to leave everything behind us and start a new life with May. Nothing paranormal happened to us for years, and we were perfectly happy to move on. May is now 5 years old. She's a brilliant, curious, happy, and a loving child. Matt needed a few things from our storage this week, and brought some old boxes home. This morning, May came into the kitchen, excited and attempting to get my attention as I was putting away the dishes. I had my back turned on her, as she kept repeating, "Mama, girl, she's funny. Mama, she's laughing." I finally turned around, thinking that she was talking about her playdate next door, when I dropped the plate I was holding on the floor. The plate shattered on the floor, as did my heart when I saw what my little girl was holding up next to her ear. May was holding up one of the old baby monitors from the old house, and on it, I could hear a child's laughter.
My story starts in 2014. I've had cash tucked away for a while to upgrade to a desktop. At the time, I had a Samsung notebook which was tiny, with a crappy Intel Atom processor and barely 2 GB of RAM. It was okay for light use such as office work and internet shopping, but gaming was out of the question. And as a gamer I would jump for the chance to game on a PC with mods and games and crap. Anyway, I'm on Craigslist looking for a desktop computer in my region late at night. I was scrolling down the page looking for a desktop that had Windows 7 on it, 4 GB of RAM and a decent CPU. I then came across a listing. This PC had 8 GB of RAM, Core i5 processor and a Gigabyte 710 GT, which was a really good graphics card at the time. Asking price? $120, which seemed like a damn good steal to me. So I logged into my account to get the seller's number for his listing page. I had a crummy old Nokia, but it still worked and dialed the numbers to get to the seller. The phone began to ring, and 15 seconds later of waiting for the seller to pick up, he finally answers.
Yes?
He says. His voice seemed old. "Oh hi, my name's Terry, and I'm calling you about the listing of your desktop on Craigslist. The one with the 8 GB of RAM and the 710 graphics card."
Oh, you're calling about that? Well, my friend, you're the first caller I've had. It's still here and waiting, and I'm free all night, so you can come back it up now.
Where are you located? I asked the seller.
I'm located at 1234 Dickham Road.
So I quickly looked up the address, and 1234 Dickham Road was in the middle of nowhere. "Is it okay if I pick it up in the morning?" I have a few things on my hands at the moment for the evening and won't be able to make it tonight.
I work during the day, but I'm home at the late hours of the night. It may be pretty hard for you to pick it up during the day. But listen, I'll stick the desktop out on the front of my porch. Just slide the money under the door whenever you arrive.
Something seemed really sus about this. It was either go with my gut and stay safe at home and find another listing, or ignore my gut and go pick it up now. At this point you can lightly tell I ignored my gut and said, okay, well I suppose I can squeeze in some time and pick it up now. I'll be over in 20 minutes.
Alrighty, see you real soon, friend.
Friend? Why would someone call me friend even though they don't know who I am? Whatever, time to go pick up this beast. I jump in my car and set my GPS for 1234 Dickham Road. I arrive at the seller's place about 20 minutes later. His house looked like one of those houses you would see in rural areas of Australia. The ones with the tin roof and made out of wood or something. Anyway, the porch lights were off, which was strange. He didn't mention about them being on or off, but it would have helped if he had had them on so that I could see. I walk up to his creaky porch and put my hand around to try and feel a rectangular shaped object. But there's nothing. Nothing at all. Perhaps he had second thoughts on where he should put the desktop. Maybe it's inside, I thought. So I knock on the door. There's no answer, and the lights inside his home are all off. I bring up my contacts list on my phone and go to recently dialed and ring the guy. The line rings for about 30 seconds and then says that the number you have been trying to call has been disconnected.
We're sorry. You have reached a number that has been disconnected or is no longer in service.
God damn. I'm in the middle of nowhere at some seller's place trying to look for a desktop I'm trying to purchase, and I can't find it if the seller's phone has been disconnected already. 10 seconds after getting off my phone, I hear something. Bang! Shit. What was that? I said to myself. I think it came from the back. My guts were telling me to run at this point. Bang! There it goes again. This time I'm spooked out and run for my car, hands shaking as I try and open my door and start the engine. I started it whilst my hands were shaking, and I haul us out of there. 3 minutes up the road, I get a message on my phone for a private number that said,
See you real soon, friend. I have a feeling I'll be seeing you again real soon.
I got home and I was still shaking. Of course, I was without a desktop. But still, at this point, my life is worth more than a computer. I go to bed and go to sleep. It took a while to relax my mind, but I eventually fell asleep and had a dream. I was back at the seller's place again in my dream. And this time I didn't have my car and it was late night as usual. I'm out the front of his place and hear a bang. The sound is coming from the back. I go round the back to see what's happening and to see if the seller was out back doing something. I couldn't see well, but I think his back door was shut. But someone was definitely over in the distance, just standing there, not moving. I feel the hair on my neck wanting to fly up at this point. Whatever was in the distance said,
Had you stayed, friend, I would have knifed and stabbed you to hell.
That's all it said, and then it just vanished. The dream was really weird, but by the time I woke up in the morning, I got onto my laptop and checked my history. Craigslist said the URL is broken or has been typed in wrong, and the seller's profile no longer exists. I needed to get my mind off things, and I could only do it at this point by going back to 1234 Dickham Road to see what the hell the seller was trying to pull. Back in the car I go, and off to the same road in daylight. Even though it's still in the middle of nowhere, I feel less spooked in the day than what I do at night, when I'm in the middle of nowhere. I pull up to the road sometime later, and the house looks like someone took a bulldozer or something through the house, because it looks collapsed and crushed. I was only there last night. How could it have been crushed already? I may never know the answer, but hopefully whatever caused the house to collapse had a good reason to do it. Let this be a warning to you all. Never venture into places in the middle of nowhere late at night to pick something up. And if you still want to do it, take a few friends and pack some weapons in the car. You just never know what shit you might face while picking something up in the middle of nowhere.
So, I was babysitting my little brother. I was 14 and he was 4 at the time. He would talk as he fell asleep because he had quite a few imaginary friends that he would sometimes tell goodnight to before he went to sleep. One night he was talking, and unlike normal, I heard something in the background of the baby monitor, and I went upstairs to see if one of his toys had come on. When I got up there, nothing was out of the ordinary, and he told me he was just talking to the old lady. I didn't think anything of it, because, like I said, he had an active imagination. A few months later, we were looking through some old family photo albums, and he pointed to a picture and said, "That is the old lady that tells me goodnight. It was my great-grandmother, who died when I was 5.
My husband began working overnights a few months ago. So this means my dog and I usually watch TV and sleep the night away before he arrives home. Sometimes I'll just draw all night long whilst the dog sleeps at my feet. And when the weather is decent, I'll take her out for a jog, or I'll take her to my friend's house so that we don't die of boredom. One night, whilst drawing some fan art for my favourite band, I decided to put my drawing pad down and go for a walk to get a soda for myself and maybe a pack of peanut butter crackers for the dog. I got the dog ready and we left. I remember this happening around late summer because our town likes to prepare for Halloween 2 months in advance. Pumpkins began appearing everywhere, and my dog liked to try to stop and steal the tiny pumpkins from the cute displays that littered our town. I can't count how many times I would have to apologize for my rude dog's behavior. So whilst we were jogging, I was carelessly dragging my 70-pound pit bull mix away from her beloved tiny pumpkins, when a man across the street began yelling something that I couldn't make out at the time. Of course, I turned around and asked him what he had said. We had a short and uneasy conversation that went something like this. "Yeah, so what are you doing out here? It's kind of late." I'm just taking the dog out for a walk." "Why? Isn't the old man supposed to be doing that?" said the man. I wondered if I even knew this guy. He'll be back from work when I get home." Then the man replied, "Oh really? Does he always let you take the dog out this late?" After the man said that, he started moving across the street quickly and would not break eye contact with me. I started backing away. I was ready to run, but my 70-pound blue pit bull mix started growling and snarling. Somehow my dog knew that this was not right. The man snapped out of his bullshit and looked down to see my dog flashing her pearly white teeth. My dog lowered her head and stared this idiot in the eyes. The man tried to laugh it off and took one more step forward, which sent my dog into a rage. My dog lunged and barked like she was going to rip his head off. I thank God I had a grip on her leash, otherwise this man might have been doggy kibble. The man finally got the hint and turned back. He muttered something to himself as he walked away, and I couldn't make out what it was. I don't even want to know, to be honest. I'm just happy that my dog was there that night, because otherwise who would have known how that conversation could have gone differently. I need to point out that my dog has always been very friendly and has never growled or tried to attack anyone before or after this incident. I'm just so glad that she was there to save my ass from that guy that night. So creepy guy, that is overly concerned about women that walk their dogs at night. Let's never meet again, or my dog may take a good bite out of your ass next time.
So, I was delivering to a hospital one night. I went through the doors that were on the delivery description. I wound up at a check-in desk, where no one was around. Behind me were several recovery rooms, all with the lights out. I looked around for anyone who might have placed this order, but ended up hanging out at the front desk for a few more minutes. From the room directly to my right, I could hear a sad, weak voice say, "I just want to go home." I turned and saw a man with multiple tubes in and out of him. His lamp was faintly lit, and he was locking eyes with me. At that moment, the person who ordered showed up at the desk, and we did the little pizza exchange. As I turned around to leave, I looked into the room where the guy with the tubes was, and there was no one there. No light on, no tubes, and no sign that anyone had ever used the bed. I made sure that it was the correct room by pretending to forget where the exit was, and examined a few rooms, all of which were empty. Every time I think about it, it still freaks me out.
So, I was living in a block of 6 apartments, and one of the other residents would periodically do some really crazy stuff, like accuse the neighbours of spying on her because they were on their porch and she could see them over the fence between the properties, or accusing me and the guy I live with stealing her post, or just having shouting matches late at night with whoever was around. The police were called on her repeatedly, but they didn't do a whole lot. She escalated to smashing the glass panels out of the door to one of the other apartments and going inside because she was convinced that they had stolen her mobile phone and milk powder. She proceeded to scrawl a whole lot of Bible-related nonsense all over the wall outside of their place. Now that you have a good idea of the backstory, this is where we begin. So one night she was having a loud argument with herself, and consequently, the neighbours above her, which are beside us, got sick of her noise and engaged with her in the shouting match. I grabbed my MP3 player and began recording her, trying to get her threatening people so that the police might actually be able to do something more lasting than take her to the psych ward for a brief holiday. I've still got the recordings and a transcript of what she said, despite this happened almost a decade ago. The people who took her on for the shouting match wanted her to shut up and go home, and she wanted them to back down. I was content to record from my back balcony, that is until she actually decided to go through with one of her threats, which was to get a knife and a brick and go get them. Bolstered by her previous experience of smashing the glass from doors and reaching into the open and locked door, she got the biggest knife she could find and a brick and came upstairs. I relocated and started recording again.
You! Come to the door! You! Come on! Do you want to mess around with me? Yeah, you want to mess with me. Alright, where's that little sneak then?
The male and female occupants jumped from their back balcony to the ground floor and began to run, calling for people to get the police. I'd stopped recording at that point and stepped outside to see if they were alright. That was my mistake. The crazy lady stepped out, saw me, and target locked. I noped out of there, closing and locking the door in one smooth motion, then grabbed a large stick, a replacement broom handle, I might add, and intended to stand my ground if she decided to come after me as well. Well, by now I think she'd lost the brick, but she was quite content to smash the glass out with the butt of the knife. 3 good hits and the glass broke. Moments later the door swung open. I could have swung at her or something, but I knew damn well I'm a bark and no bite kind of guy. She grabbed the stick and tried to pull it. I held on for a moment and she swung the knife upwards at me. I gained the ability to teleport, and about half a second later I'd made my way through the living room and through an internal door to the bedroom and pulled it shut behind me. I still remember the faux Mr. T style chains hanging on the door handle, making it difficult to grip and keep pulled shut as she tried to come after me. Having lost her primary target, she decided to destroy our place, which was the next best option. We listened. Computers were thrown from desks, our TV was thrown to the ground, standing cabinet full of CDs pulled off the wall onto the TV, tables covered with stacks of magic cards tossed across the room. Everything on the walls was pulled down. She even went to the back and hurled our laundry at the neighbours below us. We were just holed up in our bedroom, furniture against the door, using a very old cell phone. This was the only thing we had to call out with, and we were trying to get the cops there. Eventually, the noise subsided. Far too long after that the police arrived, about 40 minutes after the drama had actually died down, because apparently there was someone else with a more dangerous weapon who was taking up their attention that night. As we emerged to assess the destruction, blood and debris was everywhere. She'd cut herself up in getting in, we figured, and got away relatively unscathed. It turned out there was an impression of a knife on my shirt, made in blood, and we spent the night in a neighbour's couch, and spent the next week cleaning up the mess. All in all, despite her rampage, no one was seriously hurt, nothing was seriously damaged, and she got evicted. I thought it would be the last I'd be seeing of her, and it was for the most part, until I was waiting in line for the supermarket, and someone gets too close behind me. I turn to look, and it's her. She says,
Well, look who it is.
like we shared some kind of funny experience. I had to resist the fight or flight instinct that kicked in, but we got away from her in a hurry. The last I heard, she kept her word on doing it, going for crazy please, getting out and doing it again. However, the last time she tried her little stunt, she ended up locked up.
Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. Which of these stories did you find the creepiest? Be sure to let me know in the comments section below. Please remember to smash that like button and subscribe, as you won't want to miss what I have in store for you next. If you have had a creepy or paranormal experience that you wish to share, feel free to send it to my email, which you can find in the description. You can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter at The Mortis Media for some secret stuff you won't find anywhere else. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.